Admiral Zektar stood on the bridge of his massive flagship, the Void Reaper, watching the human fleet through the viewport with barely concealed contempt. His forearms crossed behind his back as his reptilian eyes tracked the smaller human vessels maintaining their defensive formation around the mining colony of Kepler 442b. Pathetic, he hissed through his translator, the mechanical voice echoing across the bridge. 300 years of galactic civilization, and the humans still cling to these worthless rocks like frightened children. The Void Reaper was a sight that had brought terror to 17 different species across the galaxy. Nearly 4 kilometers long, its hull bristled with plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, and energy shields that could withstand the blast of a dying star. Behind it, another 47 warships of the hegemony fleet waited in perfect formation, their crews eager for the easy victory their admiral had promised. Captain Vexal, Zektar's second-in-command, approached with the characteristic clicking sound of his insectoid legs against the metal deck. "Admiral, the humans are responding to our ultimatum. Already." Zektar's laugh was a harsh, guttural sound. "I gave them one full rotation to consider surrender. They cannot possibly have made a decision so quickly. Their primitive brains require more time to process complex thoughts." The communication officer, a tall, blue-skinned Altarian, gestured toward the main display. "Sir, they're requesting to speak with you directly." Zektar turned, his massive frame casting a shadow across the command center. At nearly 3 meters tall and weighing close to 400 kilograms, he was an imposing figure even among his own species. Scars from countless battles marked his scaled hide, and his reputation as the Butcher of Vega Prime preceded him wherever he went in the galaxy. "Very well," he said, straightening to his full height. "Let them grovel. Perhaps I will allow some of their young to survive as slaves, if they amuse me sufficiently." The main screen flickered to life, revealing the bridge of what appeared to be the human flagship. Zektar had studied human anatomy extensively during his campaigns against them. They were such fragile creatures, small, soft-skinned, with only 2 arms and standing barely half his height. Their lifespans were pathetically short, and they possessed none of the natural advantages that evolution had granted the superior species of the galaxy. The human who appeared on screen was typical of their kind. Average height, brown hair already showing the gray that marked their rapid aging process, and wearing a simple blue uniform that lacked any of the ceremonial decorations that proper military leaders should display. The human's expression was calm, almost serene, which irritated Zektar immensely. "I am Admiral Sarachun of the Terran Colonial Defense Force," the human said in accented but clear galactic standard. "You requested our surrender within 24 hours. I'm calling to inform you of our decision." Zektar leaned forward, savoring the moment. "Speak, human. Tell me how you will deliver your people to me, and perhaps I will make their ends swift." Admiral Chin's expression didn't change. "We respectfully decline your offer, Admiral Zektar. Instead, I'm here to suggest that you withdraw your forces from this system immediately." The bridge of the Void Reaper fell silent, except for the hum of the massive ship's engines. Then, Zektar's laughter boomed across the command center, joined by the amused sounds of his officers. Several of them had to lean on their consoles to keep from collapsing with mirth. "Withdraw." Zektar wiped a tear from his eye with one of his lower arms. "Human, do you suffer from some sort of mental deficiency? Perhaps your species' short lifespan has affected your reasoning abilities?" He gestured broadly toward the tactical display showing the 2 fleets. "You have 12 ships, the largest of which is barely 600 meters long. I command 48 vessels of the hegemony, including this flagship that could crack your entire colony's planet in half. Your weapons are chemical-based projectiles and primitive energy beams. Mine harness the power of quantum singularities and dark matter streams." Admiral Chin nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely correct about the numbers, Admiral. However, I think you may have overlooked something important." "And what?" Zektar said, his amusement beginning to fade into annoyance. "Could I possibly have overlooked?" "The fact that humans don't fight the way you expect us to." Before Zektar could respond, his tactical officer suddenly spoke up. Admiral, I'm detecting some unusual readings from the human ships. What kind of readings? Zektar demanded, his attention splitting between the screen and his instruments. Their power signatures are fluctuating, sir. Almost like they're charging something, but I cannot identify what. Admiral Chun continued speaking as if nothing had happened. You see, Admiral, your intelligence reports about human technology are about 15 years out of date. We've made some significant advances since your last encounter with our forces. Impossible sector snarled. Human technology advances at a glacial pace. Your species lacks the intellectual capacity for rapid innovation. That's a common misconception, Chen replied calmly. We may not be as physically imposing as your species, or as long-lived as the Altarians, or as mathematically gifted as the Zentaurians. But we have one advantage that your people consistently underestimate, which is we're really, really good at breaking things. The tactical officer's voice became urgent. Admiral, the human ships are definitely charging weapons, but the energy signatures don't match anything in our database. These readings are completely unknown. Zektar's eyes narrowed as he stared at the human admiral on the screen. For the first time since entering the system, a small seed of uncertainty planted itself in his mind. But he quickly dismissed it. Humans were weak. Humans were primitive. Humans were prey animals that had somehow stumbled into space travel. This was simply some desperate bluff. You think you can frighten me with unknown energy readings? He growled. I have faced the biomechanical horrors of the swarm worlds. I have stood against the reality-bending psionics of the Mind Collective. Your species produces nothing but farmers, merchants, and cowards. Admiral Chun tilted her head slightly. Actually, Admiral, we also produce engineers. Very, very creative engineers. And about 6 months ago, some of our most creative engineers had a breakthrough in quantum field manipulation. She paused, as if considering her next words carefully. Would you like to see what they've been working on? Before Zektar could respond, alarms began blaring across his bridge. The main tactical display lit up with warning indicators as his sensor operator shouted over the noise. Admiral, the human ships are generating massive gravitational distortions. I've never seen readings like this. Impossible, Zektar roared. Humans don't possess gravity manipulation technology. Admiral Chen's image remained steady on the screen, her expression unchanged. We didn't, she said simply, until we did. The gravitational sensors continued their frantic warnings as Zektar watched his tactical display in growing disbelief. The 12 human ships, which moments ago had appeared as insignificant dots on his sensors, were now showing energy outputs that rivaled small stars. Admiral, his weapons officer called out, should we open fire? Zektar hesitated for a crucial second, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Everything he knew about humans, everything his intelligence services had told him, everything his 3 centuries of military experience suggested, said this was impossible. Admiral Chun continued speaking, her voice carrying clearly over the chaos on Zektar's bridge. The thing about humans, Admiral, is that we don't just adapt to survive. We adapt to win. And when someone threatens our people, our homes, our children, well, we get innovative. The gravitational readings spiked again, and now Zektar could actually see the space around the human ships beginning to bend and twist, creating visible distortions in the starlight. This is some kind of trick, he said, but his voice lacked its previous confidence. Some sort of sensor deception. I'm afraid not, Admiral Chen replied. What you're seeing is the result of Project Looking Glass, humanity's first successful attempt at weaponizing artificial black holes. The words hit Zektar like a physical blow. Artificial black holes were theoretical weapons that even the most advanced species in the galaxy had never successfully created. The energy requirements alone should have been impossible for a species as technologically limited as humanity. You're lying, he whispered. Admiral Chen's expression grew sad. I really wish I was, Admiral. because what's about to happen isn't something anyone should have to witness. The tactical officer's voice cracked with fear. Sir, the gravitational fields are reaching critical mass. Whatever they're doing, it's building towards something massive. Zektar's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. Every instinct told him to attack immediately, to destroy the human ships before they could complete whatever impossible thing they were attempting. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive through countless battles, was screaming warnings he couldn't ignore. Admiral Chun, he said slowly, what exactly are you proposing? Simple, she replied. You turn your fleet around and leave this system. You report back to your superiors that Kepler 442b is under the protection of the Terran Colonial Defense Force, and that any future incursions into human space will be met with appropriate force. And if I refuse? Admiral Chun was quiet for a long moment, her eyes seeming to look directly into Zektar's soul. Then, you'll discover why every species that has ever seriously threatened humanity has eventually learned to regret it. The gravitational alarms reached a fever pitch as the readings on Zektar's tactical display climbed beyond anything his instruments had ever recorded. Space itself seemed to be crying out in protest as the human ships continued their impossible feat of physics. Zektar found himself facing a decision he had never imagined having to make. Everything he knew said the humans were bluffing, that they couldn't possibly possess such advanced technology. But the evidence of his own sensors was undeniable, and the fear in his officers' voices was real. This is your final warning, Admiral, Chun said, her voice cutting through the chaos on his bridge. Leave now, or face the consequences. For the first time in his 3 centuries of life, Admiral Zektar felt something he had never experienced before when facing humans. Genuine, bone-deep fear. Admiral Zektar's pride warred with his growing unease as he stared at the impossible readings on his tactical display. The human ships continued to generate gravitational fields that should have torn them apart, yet they remained intact, their formations steady and precise. Everything in his experience told him this was some elaborate deception, but the fear in his crew's voices was becoming infectious. Admiral, Captain Vexel approached cautiously, his insectoid features twitching with nervous energy. Perhaps we should consider a tactical withdrawal to assess this new development. Never. Zektar's roar silenced the bridge. I will not be intimidated by primitive humans and their tricks. All ships, prepare for immediate attack. Target their flagship first. Admiral Chin's image on the screen maintained its unsettling calm. That would be inadvisable, Admiral. Once we reach critical mass, there won't be any way to stop what follows. Enough of your lies. Zektar turned to his weapons officer. Fire. The order echoed across the communications network as 48 hegemony warships simultaneously opened fire. The vacuum of space erupted in brilliant displays of destruction as thousands of plasma bolts, quantum torpedoes, and dark matter beams streaked toward the small human fleet. The combined firepower was enough to sterilize an entire planet's surface in minutes. But as the weapons approached the human ships, something extraordinary happened. The gravitational fields surrounding the vessels began to bend and twist the incoming projectiles, pulling them off course with irresistible force. Plasma bolts curved away harmlessly into space. Torpedoes spiraled wildly before detonating far from their targets. Energy beams stretched and distorted until they dissipated into nothing. The bridge of the Void Reaper fell silent as everyone watched their overwhelming assault accomplishing absolutely nothing. Impossible, Zektar breathed. Nothing can deflect that much firepower. Admiral Chin's voice carried a note of genuine regret. I tried to warn you, Admiral, but you made your choice. Now you'll have to live with the consequences. The gravitational readings suddenly spiked to levels that shouldn't have been possible. Zektar watched in horrified fascination as space around the human flagship began to collapse inward, forming a visible distortion that grew larger with each passing second. Sir, his sensor operator screamed. The gravitational pull is affecting our forward ships. They're being drawn toward the distortion. 3 of Zektar's smallest destroyers, which had been positioned closest to the human fleet, suddenly lurched forward as if grabbed by invisible hands. Their engines fired at maximum power, but they couldn't break free from the inexorable pull of the artificial gravity well. Emergency reverse thrust. Sektar commanded. All ships, full retreat. But it was too late for the destroyers. As the crews watched in horror, the 3 ships stretched and elongated as they approached the gravitational anomaly. The metal hulls groaned and twisted as competing forces pulled them in different directions. Then, in a flash of brilliant light, they simply ceased to exist, pulled beyond the event horizon of humanity's impossible weapon. The human flagship now sat at the center of a growing sphere of twisted space-time that devoured light itself. Around it, the other human vessels maintained their formations with mechanical precision, their own gravitational fields creating a complex web of distortions that seemed to feed energy into the central anomaly. Admiral Chen said, her voice now carrying across space with supernatural clarity. I'm going to give you one more chance. Order your fleet to retreat beyond the edge of this solar system, and I'll allow you to leave intact. Zektar's remaining ships had managed to halt their forward momentum, but several were still dangerously close to the expanding gravity well. The readings on his instruments climbed beyond anything he had thought possible as the human weapon continued to grow in power. How? He whispered, his voice barely audible. How is this possible? Humans learn from our mistakes, Admiral Chen replied. 300 years ago, when we first encountered the galactic community, we were exactly what you thought we were: primitive, weak, technologically backward. We were conquered, enslaved, pushed around by every species that thought they could take advantage of us. The gravitational anomaly pulsed, and another of Zektar's ships, a heavy cruiser this time, groaned as its structural integrity began to fail under the increasing gravitational stress. But we adapted, Chen continued. We learned. We studied every species that defeated us, every technology that was used against us, every tactic that proved successful. And then we found ways to do it better. Zektar watched helplessly as his heavy cruiser's hull began to buckle. The ship's captain was screaming orders to his engineering crew, trying desperately to maintain structural integrity. But the gravitational forces were simply too strong. The Altarians taught us about energy manipulation, Admiral Chen said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone despite the destruction unfolding around them. The Zentorians showed us mathematical principles we'd never imagined. The hegemony itself demonstrated the effectiveness of overwhelming force. The heavy cruiser imploded with a flash of light as its fusion reactor was crushed beyond its safety parameters. The explosion was immediately pulled into the gravity well, adding its energy to the growing anomaly. And from every species that thought humans were too weak to matter, we learned the most important lesson of all, Chen said. Never underestimate your enemy. Terror was spreading through Zektar's fleet as ship after ship reported dangerous gravitational stress. The artificial black hole continued to grow, its event horizon expanding with each passing minute. Soon it would be large enough to affect even the ships at the rear of his formation. All ships retreat, Zektar finally commanded. Emergency jump to hyperspace. Immediate evacuation of the system. But Admiral Chen's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't recommend hyperspace travel while under gravitational influence, Admiral. The dimensional stress could tear your ships apart during the transition. She was right, and Zektar knew it. Hyperspace jumps required precise calculations and stable space-time conditions. The massive gravitational distortions surrounding his fleet would make such calculations impossible. Then, what do you suggest? He asked, hating himself for showing weakness, but knowing he had no choice. Conventional engines only. Slow, steady retreat until you're beyond the gravity well's influence. Then you can jump safely. Another ship, a fast attack corvette, suffered a catastrophic hull breach as gravitational tides pulled its frame in multiple directions. The crew managed to evacuate in escape pods, but the vessel itself was lost. "Admiral," his navigation officer called out, "at current engine power, it will take us nearly an hour to reach safe jump distance." An hour of watching his ships being slowly destroyed by a weapon that shouldn't exist, wielded by a species he had dismissed as harmless. The humiliation was almost unbearable. "Sir," Captain Vexel approached again, his voice carefully neutral. "Should we signal the retreat?" Zektar closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of military pride crushing down on him. When he opened them again, Admiral Chun was watching him with what looked like sympathy. "You don't have to watch your crews die for nothing, Admiral," she said gently. "There's no shame in recognizing when you're outmatched." "This is impossible," Zektar said again, but his voice lacked conviction. "Humans don't possess this level of technology." "We do now," Chun replied. "The question is what happens next. Your fleet retreats, reports what happened here, and hopefully your superiors are smarter than you are today. Or," she gestured toward the growing anomaly that was slowly consuming his ships, "or we find out just how many vessels you're willing to sacrifice to your pride." Zektar watched another of his destroyers begin to show stress fractures along its hull. The ship's captain was reporting that they were losing structural integrity, that their engines couldn't generate enough thrust to escape the gravitational pull. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Zektar found himself facing an enemy he couldn't intimidate, couldn't outgun, and couldn't understand. The humans had somehow leaped centuries ahead in technological development, creating weapons that defied everything he thought he knew about physics. "Signal the fleet," he said quietly. "General retreat. All ships to move to safe jump distance using conventional engines only." "Yes, sir," his communications officer replied, relief evident in her voice. As his ships began their slow, humiliating withdrawal, Admiral Chen's image remained on his screen. "Admiral," she said, "there's something else you should know." Zektar looked up wearily. "What now?" "The weapon you've seen today isn't unique to this ship or this system. Every human colony, every human world, every human station now has access to this technology. We made sure of that." The implications hit Zektar like a physical blow. If the humans could deploy these gravitational weapons anywhere, it meant the entire strategic situation in this part of the galaxy had changed overnight. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Admiral Chen's expression grew serious. "Because I want you to understand something very important when you report back to your superiors. This isn't about territory or resources or even revenge. This is about sending a message to every species in the galaxy that thinks humans are easy targets." She paused, watching as another of his ships barely escaped the expanding gravity well. "The message is simple. We're done being victims. And anyone who tries to make us victims again will discover just how creative humans can be when properly motivated." As the Void Reaper slowly pulled away from the impossible weapon that had shattered his fleet, Admiral Zektar realized that everything had changed. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would he. The retreat from Kepler 442b became the longest 3 hours of Admiral Zektar's life. Ship after ship reported structural damage from the gravitational stress, while his engineers worked frantically to keep hulls from buckling under forces they had never encountered before. By the time his fleet reached safe hyperspace distance, he had lost 7 vessels and nearly 3,000 crew members to humanity's impossible weapon. But the physical losses were nothing compared to what the encounter had done to his understanding of the galaxy. As the last of his damaged ships completed their hyperspace calculations, Zektar stood alone on his bridge, staring at the tactical display that showed the human fleet still maintaining position around their colony. The gravitational anomaly had collapsed once his ships were clear, but the memory of its power would haunt him forever. "Admiral," his communications officer spoke hesitantly, "Hegemony High Command is requesting an immediate status report." Zektar closed his eyes. How could he possibly explain what had happened? How could he tell the most powerful military organization in the galaxy that 12 human ships had utterly defeated a force 50 times their size without firing a single conventional weapon? Sir, the officer pressed gently. Tell High Command. Zektar paused, choosing his words carefully. Tell them that the human situation requires immediate reassessment. The full report will follow. As his fleet jumped to hyperspace, leaving the Kepler system behind, Admiral Zektar began composing the most difficult message of his career. How do you tell your superiors that everything they believed about their enemies was wrong? 3 days later, Zektar stood before the Hegemony War Council on the fortress world of Malachar Prime. The massive chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all unified under the Hegemony's banner of galactic domination. The assembled admirals, generals, and political leaders listened in stunned silence as he recounted the encounter. You're telling us, Supreme Admiral Thakron said slowly, his massive bulk shifting in his command throne, that the humans have developed gravitational weapons capable of creating artificial black holes? That is correct, Supreme Admiral. And that they use these weapons to destroy 7 of our ships without sustaining any damage themselves? Correct. The chamber erupted in angry voices as various officials shouted their disbelief. Admiral Zektar stood motionless as accusations of cowardice, incompetence, and outright lying filled the air. He had expected this reaction. Supreme Admiral Thakron raised one of his massive hands, and silence fell immediately. Admiral Zektar, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You have served the hegemony for 3 centuries. Your record is impeccable, your victories numerous. But what you're describing is impossible. With respect, Supreme Admiral, I thought the same thing, until I watched it happen. The Supreme Admiral's eyes narrowed. Humans are barely capable of faster-than-light travel. They've been in space for less than 500 of their short years. The technology you describe would require thousands of years of advanced research and development. Perhaps, Zektar replied carefully, we have underestimated their capacity for rapid innovation. General Vorthake, the hegemony's chief military strategist, leaned forward. Even if we accept your report as accurate, Admiral, surely this was some kind of experimental weapon. They cannot possibly have mass-produced such technology. Zektar remembered Admiral Chen's final words to him. According to their admiral, every human colony now has access to these weapons. The silence that followed was deafening. If that was true, it meant that every military calculation the hegemony had made regarding human space was now obsolete. The humans had gone from being an insignificant border irritation to a potential existential threat overnight. Supreme Admiral Thakron stood slowly, his 3-meter frame dominating the chamber. Assuming your report is accurate, Admiral, what do you recommend? This was the moment Zektar had been dreading. Everything in his military training told him to recommend immediate escalation, overwhelming force, the complete destruction of human space before this new threat could spread. But he couldn't forget the calm certainty in Admiral Chen's voice or the casual way she had demonstrated power beyond anything the hegemony possessed. I recommend, he said quietly, that we open diplomatic channels with the human government immediately. The chamber exploded again, but this time with outrage rather than disbelief. Dozens of voices shouted their fury at the suggestion that the mighty hegemony should negotiate with humans as equals. Diplomatic channels? General Vorthake's voice rose above the chaos. With prey animals? Have you lost your mind, Admiral? I have gained perspective, General, Zektar replied. The humans are no longer prey animals. They may never have been prey animals. We simply failed to recognize what they were becoming. Supreme Admiral Thakron studied him for a long moment. Explain. 300 years ago, we conquered human space easily because they were unprepared and technologically inferior. But instead of remaining conquered, they adapted. They learned. They studied our tactics, our technology, our strategies, and they found ways to not just match them, but exceed them. He gestured to the tactical displays surrounding the chamber. Look at our intelligence reports from the past century. Human technological advancement has been accelerating exponentially. We attributed this to captured alien technology, but what if we were wrong? What if they were developing their own innovations at a pace we couldn't comprehend? Impossible, General Vorthake insisted. No species develops that quickly. No species we know of, Zektar corrected. But consider this. Humans have only been spacefaring for 5 centuries. Yet in that time, they've colonized over 200 worlds, established independent governments, and now apparently developed weapons that exceed our most advanced technology. What does that tell us about their potential? The chamber fell quiet as the assembled leaders considered his words. Finally, Supreme Admiral Thakron spoke. What exactly are you proposing, Admiral? I propose that we classify human space as a restricted zone until we can properly assess the extent of their technological capabilities. No military operations, no expansion into their territory, no aggressive actions of any kind. You want us to show weakness to humans. General Vorthake's voice dripped with disgust. I want us to show intelligence, Zektar replied. If the humans truly possess the weapons I witnessed, then any aggressive action on our part could result in the complete destruction of this fleet, this world, and possibly the entire hegemony. The Supreme Admiral was quiet for a long time, his ancient eyes studying the tactical reports spread before him. Finally, he looked up. Admiral Zektar, you will return to the human border regions with a diplomatic mission. Make contact with their leadership. Determine the extent of their capabilities and their intentions. Until we know more, all military operations in human space are suspended. The decision sent shockwaves through the assembled leadership, but the Supreme Admiral's word was absolute. As the council dispersed, Zektar found himself facing a mission unlike any in his long career. 2 weeks later, Admiral Zektar found himself once again approaching human space, but this time with a single ship flying diplomatic colors. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was returning to the same species he had dismissed as primitive prey, now seeking to negotiate as equals. His communication with the human authorities had been surprisingly straightforward. They had agreed to a meeting on the neutral station at Proxima Junction, a trading post that served as an unofficial border between human and hegemony space. Admiral Chun was waiting for him when he arrived. In person, she seemed even less impressive than she had on his view screen. A small, aging human in a simple uniform, surrounded by a modest diplomatic escort. But Zektar could no longer look at humans the same way. Behind that unremarkable exterior was a mind that had outmaneuvered him completely. Admiral Zektar, she said, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Thank you for coming. He accepted the handshake awkwardly, still adjusting to the idea of treating humans as diplomatic equals. Admiral Chun, I must admit, this is not how I expected our next meeting to unfold. She smiled. Neither did I, to be honest. But I'm glad wisdom prevailed. They met in a small conference room aboard the station, with minimal security and no recording devices. It was the kind of informal setting that would have been unthinkable for a hegemony official just weeks earlier. Admiral, Zektar began carefully, I need to understand something. The weapons you demonstrated, are they truly deployed throughout human space? Admiral Chen nodded. Every major colony, every strategic installation, every fleet has access to the technology. We learned long ago that the best way to prevent war is to make war too costly for your enemies to consider. And if the hegemony were to escalate our previous territorial disputes, then the hegemony would discover why that would be a mistake, Chen replied simply. But I hope it doesn't come to that. War is wasteful, Admiral. It destroys resources, lives, and potential that could be used for better purposes. Zektar leaned back in his chair, studying this small human who had single-handedly changed the balance of power in their region of the galaxy. What do your people want, Admiral? What are your intentions? We want to be left alone, she said. We want to develop our colonies, explore new worlds, and live our lives without constantly looking over our shoulders for the next species that thinks we're easy targets. And if the hegemony agrees to respect human territorial boundaries, Admiral Chen's expression softened. Then we would be very interested in peaceful trade relationships, cultural exchanges, and mutual cooperation on projects of common interest. Despite what you might think, we don't bear grudges against the hegemony. We understand you are simply following your nature. The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days and resulted in the Treaty of Proxima Junction, the first formal agreement between the hegemony and humanity that recognized humans as equals. The treaty established clear territorial boundaries, trade protocols, and diplomatic channels. But more importantly for Zektar, it marked the end of his understanding of humans as a primitive species and the beginning of his recognition that they might be the most dangerous and unpredictable force the galaxy had ever seen. As he prepared to return to hegemony space with the signed treaty, Admiral Chen approached him one final time. "Admiral," she said, "there's something I want you to know. The technology you saw at Kepler 442b, it's already obsolete." Zektar felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I mean that while we were negotiating, our engineers were working on the next generation of defensive systems. By the time you return to your superiors, we'll have moved beyond gravitational weapons to something even more effective." She smiled at his expression of horror. "That's the thing about humans, Admiral. We never stop innovating. And we never stop preparing for the next threat." As Admiral Zektar's ship departed Proxima Junction, he realized that the galaxy had entered a new era. An era where the small, supposedly primitive humans have become the most advanced and dangerous species in known space. And they were just getting started.